In 1973, British truck operators had a problem. Their Gardner engines produced 180 horsepower from a massive 10.45-litre engine. Meanwhile, across Europe, Swedish Volvo trucks were hitting 265 horsepower from smaller turbocharged engines. But when American diesel giant Cummins arrived in Britain with their assembly plant in Shotts, Scotland, everything changed. Within 2 decades, legendary British engine makers Gardner, AEC and Leyland would be history. The Americans didn't just compete with British engines, they completely destroyed an entire industry that had dominated global truck manufacturing for over 50 years. This is the story of how one Indiana company murdered the British truck engine forever. Britain's truck engine dominance began in the 1920s when companies like Gardner, AEC and Leyland built their reputation on reliability and fuel economy. The Gardner 6LX engine became legendary among operators. This 10.5-litre naturally aspirated diesel produced just 150 horsepower, but it could run for hundreds of thousands of miles without major repairs. At AEC's Southall plant in London, engineers developed the AV760 engine series that powered everything from London buses to heavy haulage trucks. Meanwhile, Leyland Motors created their own range of engines that became the backbone of Britain's commercial vehicle industry. By the 1950s, British engines powered trucks across the Commonwealth and beyond. Gardner engines were so reliable that operators would wait months for delivery rather than buy anything else. The company's 6LXB engine, introduced in 1967, produced 180 horsepower with thermal efficiency exceeding 40%. No other manufacturer came close to these fuel consumption figures. The secret to this efficiency wasn't advanced computers, but obsessive craftsmanship. Gardner built engines like fine Swiss watches. Inside their Manchester factory, workers refused to rush. Components were cast from lightweight aluminum alloys, a rarity at the time, and painstakingly polished by hand to reduce internal friction. Their mechanical fuel injection system was tuned so perfectly it squeezed every possible ounce of energy from a single drop of diesel. They weren't building disposable parts, they were crafting mechanical masterpieces designed to outlast the trucks themselves. This fanatical attention to detail meant fuel bills stayed incredibly low, making Gardner the undisputed king of the balance sheet. British truck operators live by a simple rule. If you wanted reliability and low operating costs, you bought British. Gardner engines were virtually indestructible. AEC engines powered London's famous red buses. Leyland engines hauled freight across continents. This was Britain's golden age of diesel engineering. But across the Atlantic, a small Indiana company was about to change everything. Plessy Cummins founded the Cummins Engine Company in Columbus, Indiana in 1919. For decades, Cummins struggled to gain traction in the American market, let alone internationally. Their early diesel engines were considered unreliable compared to established manufacturers. Everything changed in 1952 when Cummins introduced turbocharging to diesel truck engines. To prove this technology wasn't just a gimmick, Cummins pulled off one of the greatest stunts in automotive history. They took their massive new turbo diesel engine, squeezed it into a sleek race car, and entered the 1952 Indianapolis 500. Against a field of lightweight gasoline racers, the heavy diesel shouldn't have stood a chance. Yet, the Cummins Diesel Special shocked the world by shattering track records and taking the pole position at over 138 miles per hour. It was an undeniable demonstration. Turbocharged diesel wasn't just for sluggish farm equipment anymore. It was the ultimate future of power. While British manufacturers were still using naturally aspirated engines, Cummins developed the N-series turbo diesel that increased horsepower by 50% without raising fuel consumption. The technology was revolutionary. By the 1960s, Cummins controlled over half of America's heavy-duty truck engine market. But America wasn't enough. Company executives looked across the Atlantic and saw opportunity in Europe's changing weight regulations. In 1956, Cummins opened their first European assembly plant in Shotts, Scotland. The location wasn't chosen by accident. Shotts was a rugged Scottish coal mining town, facing steep economic decline as local mines began to close. Cummins capitalised on government assistance grants and tapped into a community of hard-working people desperate for heavy industry jobs. It was a masterstroke of corporate strategy. By hiring local workers to build American engines on British soil, Cummins completely neutralised the patriotic buy local attitude that had protected British manufacturers for so long. They weren't just an invading foreign corporation. They were suddenly a vital local employer, quietly weaving American engineering directly into the British working class. The strategy was brilliant. By manufacturing in Britain, they avoided European import tariffs while positioning themselves inside the world's largest truck exporting nation. British operators could now buy American power with local support. The timing was perfect. British trucking was evolving rapidly. New European weight regulations allowed heavier trucks, which needed more powerful engines. For decades, British laws restricted trucks to a maximum weight of 24 tons. At that size, a 180 horsepower Gardner engine was perfectly adequate. But as international trade expanded, regulations shifted to allow massive 32-ton and eventually 38-ton transport giants onto the highways. Moving that much weight across long distances isn't just about effort. It is a simple matter of physics. You mathematically need at least 250 horsepower to keep heavy freight moving safely at highway speeds. Suddenly, Britain's ultra-reliable but low-power engines simply couldn't pull the required weight. Continental operators were demanding higher horsepower for long-distance hauling. British engines, designed for reliability over power, suddenly looked outdated. Cummins arrived with engines producing 250, even 300 horsepower. The NTC 290 produced 290 horsepower from 14 litres, while the biggest Gardner engine managed just 180 horsepower from 10.5 litres. The power difference was staggering. More importantly, Cummins engines were turbocharged and intercooled. British engines were still naturally aspirated, relying on engine displacement for power. When European truckers discovered they could haul heavier loads faster with Cummins power, the writing was on the wall. The first crack appeared at ERF, Britain's last independent truck manufacturer. For decades, ERF had relied on Gardner engines primarily. But in the early 1980s, facing pressure from customers demanding more power, ERF made a pivotal shift. They sidelined the expensive Gardner engines and standardised on Cummins. The move was devastating for Gardner. ERF wasn't just any customer. They were Gardner's showcase, the living proof that British engines could compete internationally. When ERF officially prioritised American power over Gardner, it sent shockwaves through the industry. Other manufacturers quickly followed. Dennis, Bedford, and even proud Leyland began offering Cummins engines as options. British operators, desperate to remain competitive with European rivals, started specifying Cummins power in their new trucks. The numbers tell the brutal story. In 1967, Cummins held 45% of the American heavy truck market, but virtually zero in Britain. By 1985, they were the preferred engine for British export trucks and rapidly gaining domestic market share. Gardner's response was too little, too late. They introduced the 6LXC with slightly more power than the turbocharged 6LXCT. But these engines arrived years after Cummins had established dominance. Gardner's conservative engineering philosophy, which had built their reputation, now became their death sentence. The final blow came from an unexpected source. British Leyland, owners of AEC and other engine manufacturers, was in financial crisis. The government-owned company was hemorrhaging money on failed car projects and desperately needed to cut costs. Sir Michael Edwards, British Leyland's chairman, made a ruthless decision. He closed AEC's Southall engine plant in 1979. The legendary AEC engines that had powered London buses for decades were gone forever. The factory that had employed thousands of skilled workers became a housing development. Leyland's own engines fared little better. The company's disastrous 500 series engine, with its revolutionary fixed cylinder head design, proved unreliable and expensive to repair. Leyland's engineers tried to solve a common engine problem: blown head gaskets, by casting the engine block and the top cylinder head as one solid piece of metal. On paper, it seemed brilliant. In the real world, it was a mechanic's worst nightmare. In a normal engine, if a top valve breaks, you simply unbolt the top to fix it. But with Leyland's headless wonder, a minor repair required mechanics to pull the entire engine out of the truck and dismantle it from the bottom up. It turned routine maintenance into financial ruin, destroying operator trust and pushing loyal customers toward easily serviced American alternatives. When the Leyland Marathon truck was launched, it offered Cummins engines alongside Leyland's own units. Operators consistently chose the American option. By the mid-1980s, the collapse was total. Gardner's market share had plummeted from 90% of British buses to less than 10%. The company that once powered the British Empire was reduced to making engines for fairground generators and marine applications. AEC was already dead, its Southall plant demolished. Leyland's engine division survived only by building Cummins units under license. The irony was crushing. British factories were now assembling American engines for British trucks. Today, the British truck engine industry is extinct. Gardner ceased production in the mid-1990s. AEC disappeared in 1979. Leyland's engine division became part of DAF, then PACCAR. Not one major British truck engine is still in production. Cummins, meanwhile, is stronger than ever. Their engines power everything from Dodge Ram pickups to massive mining trucks. The Indiana company that struggled for relevance in 1919 now generates $30 billion in annual revenue. Walk through any British truck depot today and you'll see the American conquest is complete. Scania engines from Sweden, Mercedes engines from Germany, DAF engines from Holland, and everywhere. Cummins engines from Indiana. The red rose badge of Gardner is nowhere to be seen. Some preserved Gardner engines still run in heritage trucks and restored buses. Their distinctive low RPM rumble attracts crowds at truck shows. Old drivers speak nostalgically about the reliability and fuel economy of their Gardner-powered vehicles. But nostalgia doesn't move freight. The death of British truck engines wasn't inevitable. It was the result of complacency, poor investment decisions, and catastrophic government interference. Companies like Gardner had decades to develop turbocharged engines, but chose to stick with proven naturally aspirated designs. They prioritized longevity over power when the market demanded the opposite. British Leyland's financial chaos destroyed AEC and weakened Leyland engines at the crucial moment when investment was needed most. Government ownership meant political interference instead of commercial decisions. While Cummins invested billions in research and development, British manufacturers struggled to fund basic engine improvements. The workers paid the heaviest price. Skilled engine builders in Manchester, London and Leyland lost their jobs as factories closed forever. Communities that had built diesel engines for generations saw their expertise exported to America, Sweden and Germany. But perhaps the greatest tragedy is what Britain lost. The country that gave the world the first diesel engine, that powered the Royal Navy and Commonwealth trucking, that built the most fuel-efficient commercial engines ever designed, no longer builds truck engines at all. Cummins didn't just compete with British engines. They systematically destroyed an entire industry through superior technology, better business practices, and relentless global expansion. The Americans wrote the playbook for how a foreign company can demolish domestic competitors completely. Today's British trucks are faster, cleaner and more powerful than ever before, but they're powered by foreign engines built to foreign designs using foreign technology. The red, white and blue of the Union Jack has been replaced by the stars and stripes of American engineering dominance. The Cummins conquest of Britain proves a brutal business truth. Heritage, tradition and past success mean nothing when technology shifts and customer needs change. The company that builds the best product for tomorrow's requirements wins. The company that clings to yesterday's solutions dies. British truck engines didn't just lose a market. They lost a war they never realised they were fighting until it was already over.